Neon, Sega Genesis, Evangelion. It's pretty good. Okay, no, I'm not done yet. Let's take this from the top. So the talk surrounding Neon Genesis Evangelion is soon expected to kick up again because this powerhouse series is making its triumphant return to legal viewing over on Netflix this Friday. And being that my bread and butter is talking about things I like and what I like about them, I feel like now there's really no better time to dive into EVA. EVA means a lot of things to a lot of people, but with the advent of accessible streaming, now even your college friend who thinks Seven Deadly Sins is high art will have the opportunity to take it up as a recommendation, instead of being unsure how to watch it if it's not on Netflix. This means a lot of things, namely and most importantly that Evangelion will become far more broadly and immediately available to many people who otherwise would never have come across it. And despite my gripes with Netflix's handling of producing a new dub, I hope dearly that it's a good one, because EVA is already a polarizing watch on its own without hang-ups over voice actors being part of that equation. Nevertheless, I can already anticipate with EVA's weekend streaming release that a lot of people will be watching it for the very first time, and there's a lot of trepidation in that for me, considering the almost nebulous and long-reaching influence this show has had on me ever since I watched it first back in middle school. I watched EVA at a very harrowing time of my young life, and every time I've seen it since then has seemed to provide some sort of insight to me that in another context I hadn't needed before but did then. EVA isn't exactly a popcorn watch. It's not really the type of show that Netflix traditionally heralds as an important platform selection that gets as much advertising and hype that they've been putting behind their acquisition of the property. EVA isn't a show I'd necessarily say is conducive to the fast-paced and frenetic style of television binge that Netflix has made a staple of our media consumption experience. And indeed, in that same vein, EVA itself is rather somber, slow, and methodical, and doesn't dedicate a lot of time to the high-octane thrill its emblematic giant robot fights might suggest. In fact, the robots of the show are just as much a vehicle for us viewers to put across EVA's core underlying thesis as they are vehicles piloted by human characters. And it's because of this somewhat non-conventional approach to using pictures to put ideas into people's brains that I anticipate a resurgence of one of the most popular gripes people have with EVA, which is dissatisfaction with one or both of its endings, that being episodes 25 and 26 of the television series, or the film The End of Evangelion. Somewhat uncommonly, evidently, I hold both endings to be not only good, but important and successful in conveying what they set out to put across. And for years now, I've felt frustration or a sense of loneliness in holding these opinions, because everywhere I look, I see someone describing the ways these endings failed for them, and I just can't understand them, and to many extents can't agree with them. Everyone is, of course, entitled to your own thoughts or feelings on a piece of work. It's why I hate Yuno Gasai, and several of you in your mind just told me to launch myself off a bridge just now. But it's also worth taking that leeway to try and express why something is important and successful in your eyes just as much as it's worth criticizing something you think fails. So before everybody buckles up on Friday to hear Shinji Ikari scream his little heart out, I wanted to take a moment to preempt the discussion from newcomers and detractors of old alike and offer my unapologetic defense of these endings, what they mean, and hopefully provide a little bit of insight along the way. This is a defense of Neon Genesis Evangelion's endings. So to keep things segmented and a little more structured, I'll be dividing this video into little sections, the following of which are basically this. First, I'll be talking about the television series ending, episodes 25 and 26 of the original anime. Second, I'll be talking about the film ending, The End of Evangelion. And then finally, I'll be talking about their overall cumulative impact and how they complement each other, and then present my final thoughts. And yes, I said complement. You'd be surprised at how many people suggest skipping episodes 25 and 26 entirely to then simply get to the film side of things, because it's the real ending. Spoilers, don't do that. Watch them both, trust me. With that being said, let's begin with the television ending. So episodes 25 and 26 of the original Neon Genesis Evangelion television series are controversial, to say the very least. They break the mold of most of the series prior by cutting directly from most of the outward action and into the inner psyche of its principal characters. Commonly, it's thought that this ending was born out of budgetary issues towards the end of the show's run, but it's actually a lot more complicated than that. Throughout the course of the series run, things were changing a lot over on the production end of things. For one, as the series headed to a darker tone, sponsors dropped like flies to maintain a cleaner brand branding image, and this meant less overall money than previously thought was available to work with. As a result of these increasing complications, the initial story as early as episode 13 began to radically derail, with the original script being abandoned in favor of a shift of focus happening retroactively as director Hideaki Anno's vision for the show changed. This focus was brought to a head when Anno developed an intense curiosity for psychology after an acquaintance lent him a book about mental illness. This meant that not only the scope, but the entire landscape of Evangelion's intent was being challenged by its own creator halfway through an already tumultuous and ever-straining production, and budgetary issues were only one of many reasons that the final 2 episodes ended up being as bizarrely unorthodox as they were, the least of which certainly not being that the ending had only been decided upon 3 months before it aired on television. Of course, this ending was not what everyone was anticipating, and certainly not what they felt that they were owed. It dived into the mind more than anything, and by that point had almost entirely discarded the material world of Evangelion's setting that rested outside of its cast's own heads. The end of Evangelion, commonly thought to encompass Anno's frustration and revenge towards fans dissatisfied with the television ending, was in fact the drafted original ending all along, doomed to wait for a chance for a film to be realized because of budgetary constraints, production complications, and uncooperative network censorship. As a result of these complications, Anno's steep battle with clinical depression and his increasing disenchantment with the lifestyle of Japanese otaku, as well as many other things up to and including by design, episodes 25 and 26 of Evangelion feel almost weirdly personal, like a soul being laid bare on a canvas. It's not perfect, it's rough around the edges, but it has a real weight to it, like you can grasp the human soul just radiating off of it.
どうせ動きゃしないのに、このポンコツ。ポンコツは私の方か。
Shinji begs to be helped by others, unsure where to go, wondering if he has to pilot again after having killed someone he loves. When he's asked why he pilots, he replies that it's for the good of mankind and because others treat him well.
そうだよ。いいことじゃないか。とってもいいことじゃないか。そうすればみんなが褒めてくれる。大事にしてくれるんだ。
But Shinji is lying to himself when he says this, because his reason for piloting, though he thinks it is selfless, is actually, in a way, selfish, as he does it to feel like other people need him. Asuka is similar in this regard. She seeks her own sense of value in other people because she's afraid of being alone, and she's afraid of disappearing into a crowd with nothing to make her unique. That's why she has to be good at piloting.
他人と一緒に自分もいなくなるから怖いんでしょ。だからエヴァに乗ってる。うるさい！うるさい！うるさい！
Rei can't even understand her own sense of self because Rei is a forged soul, but she wants to identify based on how she's shaped by her interactions with other people, and she's scared to not exist, having so barely understood what it meant to exist in the first place.
人の真似をしている偽りの物体に過ぎないのよ。ほら、あなたの中に暗くて何も見えない、何もわからない心があるでしょ。
What you might gather about all of this psychological extrapolation is that this ending is very focused on the interpersonal, but mostly on the perception of self and others that supplements that inner understanding. This world of closed realities that protects weak hearts and few pleasures belongs to Shinji's desire, and thus everyone else's, to close themselves off from others, to avoid the pain both of relationships, of isolation and rejection. This is the ultimate goal of Seele, the shadowy organization operating in the background of Evangelion's narrative perpetually. They seek to enact this specific scenario detailed more clearly in the film, which they call the Human Instrumentality Project. Instrumentality is poised to meld all of humanity into somewhat of a primordial whole, returning everyone to nothing for the sake of comfort and lack of fear in being one. This in turn mirrors Shinji's tendency to run from his problems, but it's also what makes his aversion to running, his disgust with himself for running, a compelling character struggle as we question the validity of his choices, his outlook, and his perception of self in relation to those decisions.
僕に価値が欲しいんだ。 誰も僕を捨てない。大事にしてくれるだけの。
Shinji feels unwanted and useless, so he perceives himself as having no hang-ups or fear around the idea of not existing. But in fact, deep within himself, he is afraid of not existing. He fundamentally fears failure, and more specifically failure to be loved. This, in one way, is emblematic of Shinji's character in a personal sense, because of his desperation to be cared for by his father, who abandoned him as a child, but also his aversion to his father out of fear of him and his disapproval. In another way entirely, though, it's emblematic of Eva's thesis on humanity as a whole, whole, instrumentality is taking place because humans fear failure, fear rejection. Humans cannot live alone, but they're separate entities, thus conflict and pain is created between them. The friction that arises between people, their conflicting views and desires, their emotions, their needs, and a cavalcade of other personal factors determine the scope of the pain they inflict on one another, and in a very real sense, it's scarily easy to see salvation in some sort of primordial unity, similar to the kind instrumentality proposes that humanity return to. But in a realer sense, an aversion to experiencing the pains of life and of relationships that come about as a natural side effect of living as an individual can also be a form of running away, right? What are you alive for? Who are you living for? Are you happy being alive? Do you hate feeling lonely? Do you hate suffering? Yes. So that's why you run away. But running away hurts just as much as what you run away from, even when others tell you that you can run if you want to. If you run, others will forsake you. If you run, you won't receive their praise. You're afraid of being hurt, but in that isolation, you convince yourself that you're the only one who is capable of hurting. Shinji has convinced himself to believe all of his bad perceptions of himself so that he has to do things like pilot the Evangelion because of a fear that he will no longer have any sense of value to offer anyone if he does not. He hates himself and convinces himself that everyone too hates him just as much, but both of these perceptions are mistaken falsehoods related intrinsically to his own seemingly inseparable sense of self-doubt. Shinji wants to be worth something so that no one will leave him behind. But what he fails to understand in this is that the only person who can determine someone's worth is themselves. A person is the sum of items and symbols they recognize as themselves, and only that person can truly understand themselves, because everyone else's perception of you is just that, a perception. Perception shapes not just one's own self, but one's own world, similarly, because perspective colors so much of what we believe. Sunny days are happy, rainy days are sad. That's just what you know to be true, but it doesn't have to necessarily be true, right? Rainy days can still be happy days if you really want them to, and it's that ease of alteration of perception that makes the self so ultimately vague in that regard as well, especially when it comes to one's own worth. To desire the world of perfect freedom is to desire a world where nothing exists. If you're given a ground to stand on, it's a restriction, but even now that you can't fly, you find security in walking the ground. In any world, things change, and those things changing also change the people interacting with those things. A person can shape their world just as easily as themselves, but they naturally have to do so within the presence of other people, because knowing your own shape is impossible without something to compare yourself to. Being around others is scary, it's trepid, it's painful, but it's also necessary, enlightening, and essential. You can know yourself, but only in the presence of other people can you shape and subsequently complete yourself. It's this realization of perspective that upends Shinji's own perception of the world, that reminds him that he can choose to learn to love himself, to be himself, and to feel deserving of being in the world that he inhabits. The famous congratulations round of characters clapping in this sense is as far away as you can possibly get from a left-field, dissatisfying load of nothing. It's an acknowledgement of Shinji's own personal growth and capability to see life's potential for what it truly is, something that's certainly worth a round of applause. Okay, Nezumi, I can hear you saying, but still, what did this have to do with the ongoing plot? Well, bear with me for a moment, because I'm here to argue something a little off the beaten path. That being, the plot doesn't matter. Okay, well, it does matter. I mean, it contextualizes everything we've seen up to this point and colored why we should even care about these things in the first place, so it would be disingenuous to say that the plot doesn't matter at all in the grand scheme of things. My point, though, I suppose, is less that the plot doesn't matter, and more that these loose ends, these points of contention, were never really designed to be a central focus. The robot fights in Eva are a couple of things, and they're placed into their respective episodes with an adhesive surface of both audience bait and metaphor alike, which is to say the closer you are to the beginning of Eva, the more the robot fights are there to hook you in with something vaguely familiar and entertaining, and the deeper you are into Eva, the more the robot fights fade into the background as the true focus comes to light. That's not to say the Evas or the Angels are entirely void of these thematic importances, though, because they share a veritable amount of limelight in all of this too, even if it's not quite as much. Angels are a derivative type of life form in similar origin to humans, but because of their fundamental differences, it's nigh impossible for them to coexist, mirroring the struggles of people to coexist similarly. This is all but outright shoved in the viewers' faces with the introduction and subsequent death of Kaoru Nagisa, who straddles the line between both parties, and the resulting fallout is more than a little important, not just for Shinji, but for the implications at large that it leaves in its wake. Similarly, the Evangelion units themselves mirror the dependent relationships they embody, the yearning for a missing mother figure experienced both by Shinji and Asuka for strikingly different reasons that both play into their extreme needs to be validated by their piloting experiences. And I mean, really, do I even need to bring up the AT fields, a barrier that angels and Evas alike can manifest to physically block the touch of others? Sure, this gets way more overt in the end of Evangelion, but even as it stands here, you can't turn a blind eye to that one, surely. The point I'm trying to make here is that the surrounding context always existed to deliver this outcome. Maybe not specifically this conveyance or this series of events, but this core, this squishy emotional center living in the deep recesses of Evangelion's labyrinthine gut, was always the final destination of its narrative. The angels, the Evas, the fate of Tokyo 3 itself were never meant to explode into a spectacular final battle for the fate of humanity, or at least not in the way you might have thought. One's own battle for humanity, their humanity, was the one to be fought here, and Eva always knew that's what was coming in the end. The final battle was with one's own self, and one's own place in the world and ability to inhabit it. That was the focus, that was the resolution to that focus. And it's a radically kind narrative to leave people with, especially in a work so otherwise seemingly entrenched in the direly morose. It's an uplifting end that celebrates people and their will to continue. And I suppose that's why when the end of Evangelion came out, everyone got super confused again. At the risk of sounding like a smug putz, the end of Evangelion is kind of like a perfect storm of a movie for viewers who skim the surface level to completely miss the point of. This is no more emblematic than with the previously stated fact that people actually thought that this movie was made for no other reason than to flip off the fans, despite having been written well in advance of the TV ending that people cite it as being revenge for. No, the end of Eva was planned and didn't reach TV, but then it got planned a little bit more for theaters, and in 1997, we finally got it. The true episodes 25 and 26, right?
The answer is yes and no.
Well, it's a little bit more complicated than that, actually, because if I'm being totally honest, I think you kinda have to see both this and the TV ending to get the cumulative Evangelion finale experience, but I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself. To set the stage, let's start off with a small recap of events in this movie. And by small recap, I mean we're gonna go beat by beat for a little while. It's gonna take a little bit, just bear with me. EOE picks up immediately after the events of episode 24 of the original anime. If episodes 25 and 26 in the TV series were exclusively in the mind, this is basically what was happening outside while all of that was happening inside. Shinji almost drowns himself at the lake, but basically mopes around until he gives up, upon which he visits Asuka in the hospital, begging her to help him. Despite her being consistently comatose, he keeps asking her to wake up, but then in the midst of the shaking manages to accidentally undo her hospital gown and let her boobs out, at which point and he hates himself for it. Meanwhile, it's discovered that Seele is trying to hack into NERV's Magi system in a bid to bring about Third Impact on their own terms by using the Evangelions. Gendo has his own plans for the fun, cool apocalypse party, though, and turns down their sweet invite in favor of wanting to merge individual souls into Evangelion bodies, with him becoming a god and getting to rejoin his dead wife for sweet, sweet reunion sex. Of course, since Seele wants all souls to be merged into one single being to do that whole instrumentality thing that we talked about in the TV ending segment, they decide to go all G.I. Joe on everyone's ass and basically just start killing everyone at NERV headquarters. A bunch of swell guys. Ritsuko is brought out of solitary confinement for the sole purpose of trying to beef up the Magi system, but that doesn't really change the effect of bullets on human bodies, so that proves to not really help. The heavily armed soldiers basically get little to no adequate resistance from the ill-equipped NERV personnel, and they indiscriminately slaughter any of them that they come across, even killing people who try to completely surrender. Meanwhile, knowing that the Eva pilots are the Force's primary targets, Misato orders that they be placed in their Evas for safety, despite Asuka being comatose, Rei being missing, and Shinji being, well, depressed, but also definitely in direct danger of being shot. Asuka and Unit 2 are sent to the bottom of a nearby lake, while Misato decides to bail out Shinji on foot. Gendo finds Rei in Terminal Dogma and takes her down to where Lilith's at, just as Misato arrives just in time to kill some JSS-DF soldiers like a badass and save Shinji from getting a bullet put through his head. Of course, Shinji has to be literally dragged in tow, but at this point she's willing to do that. Misato recovers her car and drives towards the Eva cage. She explains her findings to Shinji, telling him that she found out the truth about the cause of second impact, that it was engineered intentionally by Seele, and passes it on to Shinji. The reason, of course, originates from the battle between angels and humanity, with humanity being born from Lilith, and Adam's children being humans that gave up human form, meaning humanity and angels are one and the same, yet also unable to coexist, making mankind the final and 18th angel. Meanwhile, Asuka wakes up and realizes that her dead mom's soul is in a robot, jumps up and starts kicking some ass. Of course, good things can never last, as 8 white Evas from Seele arrive, Misato gets shot, and Shinji boards an elevator after getting a definitely empty promise from a definitely dying woman. A bomb goes off, killing Misato, as Asuka tears apart the mass production Eva series. Unfortunately, just as her power supply runs out, a Longinus spear rams right through her eye like paper mache, and the Eva series reactivates, tearing her guts out and killing her with aerial spear attacks because, I don't know, just for the heck of it, I suppose. If you're gonna go big, you know? Shinji finally gets up to ground zero in Unit 1, but obviously freaks out upon seeing filet a la Asuka because, wow, that is gross. Realizing that Unit 1's out and about, Gendo tells Rei that the only way for him to see Yui again is to unite Adam and Lilith. Right as Unit 1 breaks out of its bindings and summons Moon Spear, which stops right at its neck. Seele decides to just wing it and do instrumentality now because screw it, might as well, and sets it into motion by using Unit 1 and Shinji as a conduit. The MPEs crucify Unit 1, and a giant explosion reveals the Black Moon, Lilith's egg, within the geofront. Aware that Shinji is in pain, Rei defies Gendo, absorbs his arm, and joins Lilith on her own. Gendo begs Rei to wait for him, but she's like, nah, and is absorbed into Lilith, which then breaks out of Nerve HQ. Upon seeing giant naked Rei, Shinji just completely loses it, as the now deformed Eva series move and resonate with her. Shinji's ego barrier weakens as giant naked Rei also becomes giant naked Kaworu, and Unit 1 turns into a tree of life, with Fuyutsuki remarking that humanity's fate is now in Shinji's hands. Here's where things get a little more mixed with our TV ending, so hang tight. Instrumentality begins as we see little Shinji making a sandcastle. His friends have to leave, at which point he decides to sadly complete the castle by himself, which comes out looking like Nerve HQ, which he then kicks down. But after destroying it, he cries and begins to rebuild it again. Shinji observes Misato and Kaji screwing for a week during college, and Misato presently admits that she probably did things like this to confirm her own existence. Asuka calls it stupid lonely adults licking each other's wounds, while Ritsuko explains that it's nice to feel needed, even if it's only physical. Asuka says Shinji can't understand her or help her, and that his ego is the only thing that emboldens him to think so. He says it's impossible to understand her if she never tells him anything, while Rei asks Shinji if he ever truly tried to understand her. Asuka tells Shinji she knows about how he uses her for his own comfort, citing the scene from earlier, going on to say that if she can't have all of him, she wants none of him. As all of the women in his life gather in the personal hell train car, Shinji recounts how he's been hurt by their ambiguous smiles, which is to say that they conceal a painful truth, but he isn't willing to accept that because that ambiguity only makes him feel more insecure. Asuka and Shinji tassel for a bit before Asuka calls him a liar for saying he needs her because anyone would do as long as they don't scare him, and that he never loved anyone seriously because he only cares about himself, but even then still can't even like himself. Shinji asks once again to be helped, not abandoned, and when Asuka refuses him coldly, he loses his temper and strangles her as third impact begins. Shinji says he thought it was a world where nobody would betray him, and Rei replies that it was wrong of him to assume everyone felt the same as he did. He bitterly remarks how everyone, including him, should just die, but then Rei asks him why he exists, and if he's here, then why is that the case? Asking if it's okay for him to be here, Shinji is met with silence. Everyone on Earth is hit by Lilith's anti-AT field, which decomposes their physical forms and joins them all into a sea of LCL, one whole. Down in Terminal Dogma, Gendo expresses how he's waited for this moment to see Yui again, but admits that without her at his side, he'd abandon Shinji for fear of being rejected because he believes nobody can love him, that he's undeserving of love. Kaworu interjects that he was simply running away before anyone could betray him, likening him strangely to his own son in some respect, and that he closed off his own heart to escape the fear of rejection. Yui turns into Unit 1 and picks up Gendo, who accepts his punishment, apologizes to his son, and gets his entire upper body bitten off. In space, the MPEs spear their cores with replica spears, entering the doors of Guff. The Tree of Life enters Lilith, and this is where we can presume our episodes 25 and 26 from earlier fit into the chronology of events. On the inside, Shinji realizes the world of instrumentality isn't right, and that even if individuals existing separately could cause them pain again, it's alright, because it's better for the world to exist as it was, flaws and all. Shinji explains that because he felt pain, he kept running away, but then he realized that running away was just as bad, because it was as if nobody existed anymore.
それは現実の続き。それは夢の終わりよ。
Rei and Kaworu appear, claiming to be the hope that people can one day understand each other, as well as the words "I love you." Shinji says that although he may one day be betrayed and deserted, he wants to see everyone again because he knows above all else that his feelings with them were real. Bursting out of Lilith's eye, Eva Unit 1 roars and grows wings of light. The doors of Guff close, and Lilith's black moon explodes. Lilith decomposes, petrifying as she hits the Earth, with Unit 1 similarly petrifying the MPE series with an extended Longinus spear. The wings disappear, Eva Unit 1 petrifies herself, and Kaworu, Rei, and Yui all reassure Shinji that people can restore their bodies as long as they can imagine themselves within their own heart, meaning that in all likelihood in time, humanity will reform from the Sea of LCL and become themselves again, having rejected instrumentality of their own accord. The entry plug is ejected from the Eva, and Shinji says goodbye to his mother, rising from the sea and surfacing to the beach. Time passes, and Shinji realizes that Asuka has reformed. He begins to strangle her in what I believe to be an attempt to affirm whether or not instrumentality has truly stopped, as strangling her should be an impossible emotional task in a world where everyone is whole and no bitterness exists. And realizing that he can, and it's real, and that she's real, and that she caresses his cheek to show him kindness for the first time, he begins to cry. Asuka looks up at the sky, back down to Shinji before expressing, "I feel sick," as the credits roll. Now, I see a lot of people argue that this ending is, well, yes, the middle finger thing, but we already covered that and how that's a baseless rumor, so let's tackle the other more prevalent argument, which is that it's a downer ending with a cynical and defeatist message. Excuse me, did we watch the same movie? Sure, I know the last few moments aren't exactly sunshine and rainbows, but it would be hard to do a heel-face turn that quickly after an absolute cataclysm of life. Sure, Shinji has learned a valuable lesson both about valuing the human experience and his individual self, but his emotions have been doing the worm all day. It's probably only just now starting to catch up to him. The boy's well overdue for a good cry. Besides, we know it's not as if Shinji and Asuka are the only remaining human people, as I have literally seen people say, as if they're sure that's the outcome. Like, again, did we watch the same movie? It was literally right there! Yui says that anyone who accepts and embraces their own individual form can reform and take their human shape again, just like Shinji and Asuka did. And frankly, if Shinji can do it, don't worry, I think most of humanity is coming back. The last few moments of the movie are a little bleak, sure, and the movie itself has a veritable load of dark moments, absolutely, but to say that the film overall has a bleak ending, one that has no optimism to speak of, is simply disingenuous, and it's to basically stare past the entire point of the movie in the first place. Right now, at the end of this journey, Shinji feels pain, and who wouldn't after all that? But the important thing is not that he slumped over crying on the beach. It's that he chose to come back to this world of his own volition. He chose not to meld into the gooey hive mind to escape all of his problems through a nebulous merging of consciousness with 6 billion other people on the planet. He chose to live in our beautifully imperfect, complete wreck of a world, knowing full well that he can and will feel pain, be betrayed, and feel estranged from others again, as will everyone else, because he at least knows his feelings there are real, that the world is of his own perception, and that his life is what he makes of it. It's as Yui says, anywhere can be paradise, as long as you have the will to live. And if that's not an optimistic ending, I certainly don't know what is. Evangelion's endings really kinda make up for what each other lack by supplementing in the department it needed more fleshing out with. The TV ending needed a lot more context and expansion, which EOE delivered upon, and EOE certainly benefits greatly from grafting 25 and 26 into its middle, as it cements Shinji's emotional journey before leading into his much more expansive realization about humanity as a whole. At the end of the day, I simply can't understand people who exclaim that Eva was always about style over substance and pompously throwing confusing imagery at the wall to seem fake deep, because frankly, I never thought Eva was trying to do any of those things. Neon Genesis Evangelion isn't surface level, sure, and it can become a bit much to keep up with at times, but it's never conciliatory about what it wants to say, it's never cagey about its intentions, and for all the effort people dedicate to misunderstanding it, it never once suggested to me an ounce of anything other than a humble acknowledgement of what makes human relationships so twistedly flawed and yet so beautifully necessary. Giant robots, angels, apocalyptic events, shady organizations, religious symbolism, all of that was a pretense, a gesture at the emotional underbelly that made up Evangelion's truest and most honest intent, to convey these things to us, to hope we understood, and to trust that we would take that message and learn from it. Because there's a reason that you have hands, there's a reason you have feet, there's a reason you exist, but you have to find it yourself. And your life is worth living here in order to meet people, shape yourself, and do just that. Neon Genesis Evangelion didn't forget about its plot. It was ready to put its cards on the table for all to see, finally revealing all it had been holding back. Neon Genesis Evangelion didn't spitefully shoot to ruin the audience. It planned carefully for us to experience something it wanted desperately for us to hear. And Neon Genesis Evangelion didn't prioritize manufactured depth over interesting storytelling. It prioritized humble emotion over indulgence and a lack of artfulness. Neon Genesis Evangelion ended. It ended twice, but in a very real way, it only really ended once, and maybe you could argue that it never ended at all, that its core exists within even our day-to-day lives. But I think if one thing is for certain, it's that it created one hell of an impact.
太陽と月と地球がある限り大丈夫。
Hello everybody, thanks for watching my video on Evangelion and its endings. I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope that you'll enjoy Evangelion when it hits Netflix this Friday. Hey! Hopefully the dub is good. I don't know if it's gonna be good, and I'm gonna miss the old one. I mean, it wasn't a masterpiece or anything, but I do have a lot of attachment and nostalgia to Spike Spencer and Tiffany Grant in particular. But, you know, hopefully they'll show up in the dub of the 4th Rebuild film, considering that Funimation's been dubbing all of those every time they've come out, so, you know, we still got a chance. As always, I've got a Tumblr where you can follow me for more updates. I've got a Patreon where you can donate money and get goodies to support the continued creation of my content. And of course, I've got other stuff that I'll probably link around here or something. You should watch some of my other videos too. They're pretty good. I mean, you know, not to toot my own horn or anything, but like, you know, I think they're pretty alright. With that all being said, thank you for watching and listening to me ramble about anime for this long, and I will see you all in the next video. Peace, love, respect, and please somebody stop Shinji from screaming. He's really gonna ruin his voice like